visual and performing arts, and fiction provide alternative meaning templates that meet requirements that were once considered unique to religion. To do this, the artistic or fictional text must draw upon and adequately reflect human concerns and afford space for contemplation, allowing the individual to devise or extract personal meanings from the narrative, unquote. Many figures embody these characteristics. Born in Indiana, Los Angeles-based American painter and agnostic Jim Shaw created a fictive religion, Oism, with a female deity. The Wig Museum, 27 and 2018, inaugurated the now closed Marciano Art Foundation, who were the heads of the Guess clothing empire, museum space in a former Masonic temple in Los Angeles. Or works with Christian themes which are either understood or invisible in plain sight, depending on the viewer's awareness of this symbolism. This is particular in two examples painted on Hollywood backdrops by this artist, St. George and the Dragon, or The Whore of Babylon of robber barons, using a Statue of Liberty a la the 60s American television's Barbara Eden in I Dream of Jeannie, riding a dragon transposed into corporate and government robber barons. The corporate dragon's 7 heads are early 20th century US presidents. And this requires research into why Shaw chose these specific men. Only 4 heads are horned, 1 appears to be a unicorn, and 2 have none, and reiterates the need for non-artistic research before either an artist's imagery or text can be recognized as translations or reinterpretations, as appearing in edited forms or as distant influences. In Shaw's work, this includes pop cultural icons as well as religious ones, and indicates that all media communications must be considered for their symbolic codes and messages, certainly in any environment, be it religious, political, or climate change, because capitalist privatization is the foundational force manipulating messages. Using the language of appropriation, as Naomi Klein outlined in No Logo, taking aim at the brand bullies in 1999, highlighted that logoism, not logos, had become the most reliable global language. Here, religion as defined by belief can be corporate, nationalist, entertainment, or a sports team, or causal, such as climate change. This emphasizes the importance of lateral thinking, demonstrated by American playwright Tennessee Williams' Camino Real, which begins with the character of Quixote explaining, "Blue is the color of distance." Williams expressed, quote, "My own creed as a playwright is fairly close to that expressed by the painter in Shaw's play, The Doctor's Dilemma. Quote, I believe in Michelangelo, Velázquez, and Rembrandt, in the might of design, the mystery of color, the redemption of all things by beauty everlasting, and the message of art that has made these hands blessed. Amen," unquote. How much, this is still Williams, how much his arts were blessed with, or how much mine are, I don't know. But that art is a blessing is certain, and that it contains its message is also certain. And I feel, as the painter did, that the message lies in those abstract beauties of form and color and line, to which I would add light and motion, unquote. This introduction to the subjective world of religion and spirituality prefaces how individuals subjectively politicize using these themes to counter the way political parties manipulate religious masses on points of belief, not because they are common beliefs, but because these can be easily influenced. Photographer Mary Mattingly was born in Rockville, Connecticut in 1978. Her photograph was taken in Utah, and it's at a point equidistant from Bears Ear National Monument and Dineros uranium mine. President Trump dramatically reduced the boundaries of Bears Ears National Monument by 700,000 acres for more mining in the area. The text on the pine box is from Samuel Beckett's 1953 novel, The Unnameable, quote, "It is because there is nothing. It is because I have no eyes," unquote. Mattingly asks, quote, "What do people see when they experience this land? And what is hidden? The objects in the photograph, clay used for pigments, tools containing uranium, copper used in bullets, were found in the area and exposed its contradictions. Extraction and melting processes toxify the land and its dependents, while the extracted elements are simultaneously necessary to create the goods that sustain many ways of life," unquote. This recalls the ritual objects of traditional religion and can subconsciously affect the ex-Catholic as effectively as those who are practicing. Carol Cusack noted that indigenous religions were rejected from the world religions category because they are, quote, "typically this worldly, orally transmitted, non-proselytizing, folk-oriented, expressed in myths and traditional law, and pluralist." While Western societies perceive indigenous cultures this way, so one-dimensionally reflecting so poorly on Western limitation, rather than indigenous ideologies and spirituality's integral dimensionality. Given the nature of indigenous and nature religions, it seems the dedication to climate action can not only be expected to be taken care of in terms of humanist motivations as political activism, but as an extension with their help, and of that as a contemporary religious expression. One of the co-founders of New York Abstract Expressionism, Robert Motherwell, who never spoke of religion in any specific faith or denominational context, though he did paint a self-portrait entitled it "The Homely Protestant," spoke during the Second World War at the French International Decade, occurring in exile at a women's college in the US at the time. This was 1946. Quote, "The social condition of the modern world, which gives every experience its form, is the spiritual breakdown which followed the collapse of religion. This condition has led to the isolation of the artist from the rest of society. The modern artist's social history is that of as a spiritual being in a property-loving world. No synthesized view of reality has replaced religion. Science is not a view, but a method. The consequence is that the modern artist tends to become the last active spiritual being in the great world. It is true that each artist has his own religion. It is true that artists are constantly excommunicating each other. It is true that artists are not always pure, that sometimes they are concerned with their public standing or their material circumstance. Yet for all that, it is the artists who guard the spiritual in the modern world, unquote. There are over 4,200 religions globally. The contemporary face of religion fills books such as Bouton's Religion for Atheists or Conner's Atheist Bible, the secular event as religion that Zoe Alderton, Christopher Hartney, and Daniel J. Towers' representative field work on Anzac, a performance analysis of the dawn service and other rituals. All demonstrate the potential for common and dynamic conceptual ground from both sides. Kavanaugh's Myth of Secular Violence delineates how the religion of secular politics maneuvers an irrational unease with religion. Quote, the myth of religious violence helps to construct and marginalize a religious other, prone to fanaticism, to contrast with the rational, peach-making secular subject. This myth is used in domestic politics to legitimate the marginalization of certain types of practices and groups labeled religion, while underwriting the nation-state's monopoly on its citizens' willingness to sacrifice and kill. Our violence, being secular, is rational, peacemaking, and sometimes necessary to contain their violence, unquote. It is in this secular frame that the coal industry, aligned with government and industry as it is, and against activism, fall into what, in secular terms, is viewed as rational and irrational. In secular societies, the preeminent context of capitalism's religion is that money and democratic freedom rely upon a designated enemy to manipulate the nation's masses and monetary policy. This enemy shapeshifts between religion and other, whether motivated by communism's virtue in being irreligious, or Islam, or anything other than Christianity. What religion provides here are ways to direct segments of the population against others, though whatever will distract from political dissent serves as an effective scapegoat. The 19th to 21st century artist is an unreliable target with 1 foot inside and 1 foot beyond their culture's inner circle of influence. Think of the anonymous British Banksy operating simultaneously on the streets and auction house floor. Sotheby's London sale of the self-shredding girl with a balloon from 2018 equaled the artist's previous auction record at £1.04 million, equaling his previous works. Banksy's graffiti has included Dismaland, his dystopian theme park in 2015 that a journalist wrote was unsuitable for children. His depictions of Pope Francis near the Vatican in Rome inspired Scottish graffiti artist the Pink Bears murals of the Pope and the Queen near Glasgow Stadium, and addressed France's refugee crisis with the son of a migrant from Syria in 2015, featuring one of the computer industry's religious sects, Apple co-founder Steve Jobs. Frederick Allen of Forbes wrote on, quote, the religion of Apple, Whoever said religion was dying never saw the queues that snake round Apple stores when a new product arrives. Never mind that iPad 2 was a modest and slightly disappointing upgrade on iPad 1, and that the uninitiated would scarcely be able to tell the difference. The rapturous way it was received had all the air of a revivalist meeting. Thus, the climate environment can be a political one, intellectual, historic, communal, or subjective. The range of religious and spiritual art described throughout this paper serves to highlight that religion and spirituality is neither absent or traditional, and is often really only an occasional expression or subtextual element in contemporary artists' works, or the lives of the citizen or activist. In Australia, not only have protesters faced the removal of their rights to confront corporate enterprises, and the current religious discrimination bill can only be described as the right to discriminate, are granted within the bill's far-reaching effects on how professionals and clients will encounter medical services, schools, offices, and hospitals. The religious voices like playwright and self-declared Catholic man Badham sees the Religious Freedom Bill has nothing to do with religion. It excludes and traumatizes. And seeing this bill as, quote, a Trojan horse, this undermining, for example, marriage equality and reproductive rights. The New York Times asked, quote, why is Australia trying to shut down climate activism? An increasingly outraged public is demanding action in a nation intimately linked to coal mining. The government has responded by threatening a new law to punish protesters. With thousands of religions globally and an evangelical prime minister at the helm, what climate we are in exactly is a very difficult question to answer. Thank you. What I might add is the James Turrell slide. Can you still see that, Neil? James Turrell, Quaker, they don't call it a church, they call it a meeting house. That's the whole space. He's also a pilot and mainly does light installations. And as his grandmother said, the point was to go and to let in the light. Now, he doesn't speak other than through his light, but in seeing his, an exhibit in Houston, he deals with scientific physiognomy very explicitly. When you went into the show, you had to sign up to go into one piece, which I'll speak about in a minute, because you couldn't go into it until your eyes had physically adjusted down to the lower light levels, which were extremely lower light levels, in the museum for at least half an hour. In some of the spaces, if you went in, the person just not even an arm's length away, if you looked at them that close, you could not see the features on their face. And if you looked across the space, you would see a rectangle of light. If you walked up to the space, it was a shock because that was a hole that opened to about 2.5 more meters of space, which was a different type of light created by the mix of fluorescent tubes that he used. Now, rarely, if you see an illusion where it just looks like light on a wall, and then you find out it's a hole with the light behind it. Once you go back, you don't get to see the illusion again. Because he is working off science, you can't see the illusion even though you know it's a hole. The piece that we went into once we'd been in the museum long enough, you had really, it was so black, you went down a hallway that turned and turned again and felt for the chair and sat down. And after about 12 minutes, you felt your eyeballs reach out into space, literally reaching for the light. And there were only the tiniest specks of color that were discernible after that length. So this is just a good example of how, in some cases, certainly subjectively, religion and science are not in any way divorced from each other. With his work, that's the case, and we're lucky to have several pieces of his at the National Gallery in Canberra. That's it.
So we got 10 minutes for questions, and then we should have a lunch break to keep to the schedule.
Well, thank you. Is it Jewell? Is that how you?
Yes.
That was wonderful. And I heartily agree with Robert Motherwell that the artist is the last remaining spiritual being. That's how it feels to me sometimes anyway. But thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Varis, you'll have to unmute yourself.
It myself.
Yeah. Oh. Varis, you're still muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
So big deal. Thank you so much, Jewell, for your presentation. It was amazing. Do you think that the artists are the people who are in search of the miraculous, if I may use the expression by Uspensky, and in the sense they try to find the transcendent within the material?
Many are. Not all, but many are.
Who are not?
Well, I'd say it's the ones that say my art doesn't mean anything. And because there are artists who say my work doesn't mean anything. Which is impossible. As soon as you say it means nothing, it's actually incredibly meaningful, because, well, what are you saying? You know, to assume something can mean nothing, and your intention for it to mean nothing is very meaningful. So, and many of that, even though oh gosh, some of it really does look like they've just picked up garbage off the street. It's not like the ready-made of the Duchamps and that kind of thing. It really, I have to say it just looks literally like garbage off the street, and then they say it doesn't mean anything. I would have to have some serious discussions on this, but I still think there are plenty of artists like Anna where some kind of connection, some kind of meaning absolutely is in the process of the work and the experience of the making, especially if you're not driven by how can I control this? I'll do a sketch and this is exactly what will happen when it turns out. It's a bit like the Gaudi Cathedral. I mean, for me, I think, how on earth could he do this without plans? And I've seen one of the ways that he did figured out the surface that looks kind of like dripped candles was a contraption that's almost like a chandelier that dealt with the plaster material and how he could make this work. So it was a very, very personal creative process. And I do think that there are artists, I would say there are directors, there are performers, there's, you know, any creative individual, the writer, the musician is clearly involved with this. And it might be an interesting point going back on the music for a moment, because I was thinking about when you were talking on all that we got to see some notations of Beethoven before, and they look like scribbles. They don't look like just notes here or there. There's the musical staffs and everything, but there's no delineation other than there's a whole bunch of noise indicated here or there. So how that notated for him what he would continue to reproduce is quite extraordinary, because it obviously did. So I think that kind of helps speak of what you're speaking about, where I could look at that piece of paper and go, how could he know what that is to repeat? And it was. I hope that helped.
Yeah, that's good.
Aren't we afraid of, although, because you mentioned another dimension, sorry for asking again, aren't we a bit afraid of civil religions today? Because you mentioned about the Anzac. I mean, civil religion, as you see what the Anzac ritual is about, which is about social bonding, essentially, right? Social bonding. We try to find a myth, a grand myth to bring us all together. I mean, can we have grand myths in the era of deconstruction?
It's pretty tough. I mean, I think there's a need.
Yeah.
There's absolutely a need still for this, but and maybe that is explained the best by this relentless production of the superhero movies.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's relentless. It's not like the occasional. It used to be, you know, that's fine. We would occasionally have, but is anything made other than that now? Is almost how it seems. So this is something absolutely continuous. We need stories. We need myth. We know this as far as performance makers. Artists certainly know this. It's not going to stop. So the desire to put this into the civil, because they don't dare put it into, I'm not going to go there as far as religion, maybe not even finding out the fact of what actually defines religion. The story is of what we know is just so tiny compared to the billions subjectively doing this now. So I think you put a big point, absolutely, raising that there on we need the big. We're searching for this connection. Very good point. And in climate, land, place, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jewell. That was great. How does the production of awe and the experience of awe work in all of this?
Oh, you can hope for it, can't you? And I think that's going to vary for everyone, because what is going to set one person off, another person won't think about. Some people, I remember seeing something on the news once, so that, yeah, well, that's right. So there are people who need to do an amusement ride or jump out of an airplane to get the adrenaline rush that some people get watching the grass grow. Literally. Now, I'm a grass grow person. That I can get just whoa off something quite minuscule but so amazing. So I think that awe is as varied as the relationship with the recipient of it, small or large. I don't think we can hope, but we can't control it.
Wow.
I think we should have the lunch break now to keep to the schedule. So if everyone can come back at to be ready to start at 1:45, that would be great. Yeah.
No.
So
Yeah.
see you then. Yeah. See you.
All right.
Oh. Hello. I got an email from the school. Where are you? Are you in bed? I got an email from the school in the middle of the thing. They wanted marks or something for the first time. Yeah.
Maybe we'll just wait a moment.
Neil, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
I will be brief since I'm the last one, so I will bring it on time. Don't worry.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
Yes.
We got probably another. Yeah, we've got another 2 minutes before we. Okay. All right. Okay, Fiona, I think we can start. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Fiona Campbell from UTS, University of Technology, Sydney. And I'm going to talk about Goethean phenomenology. Now, I was originally planning to do a paper yesterday and more of a workshop today. Because I've got a bit of health problems, I'm only doing, I didn't do yet the paper yesterday, so I've actually combined the paper and the workshop together. So it's a bit of a mix, so slides and paper. So we'll see how we go. So I'm just going to start my slides. So workshopping Goethean phenomenology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Goethean phenomenology is, and also present the work of 3 Goethean phenomenologists, 2 of them scientists, and the third one is myself. Sorry about the coughing. So just to get a little context here. If, like me, over the summer, you probably downloaded an awful lot of apps about warning us about all kinds of emergency situations, about the fires, flood, severe storm, hail, smoke, all these things that we were constantly checking on in order to see how they were going to affect our day and our lives and our physical and mental health. And what we really saw ramping up here was this increasing fear of nature as the enemy. And for instance, there's even a film, a documentary that was made last year called Bushfire Wars, where you see that it follows a dedicated team of firefighters. They wage a relentless battle against a completely unpredictable enemy. So we see this conceptualization of nature increasingly as something other than ourselves, as this enemy that we need to combat. And of course, we're seeing this more and more in the news media, particularly in relation to anything that threatens this same frame of reference of use for anything outside of the man-made world that might threaten human human dominance. So, and of course, we're seeing this also with the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's another side to seeing nature as an enemy, and that is, apart from seeing nature as a kind of a general being beneficial for us when we go out into nature, there's also this picture of nature as entertainment. And nature as something that provides us in our leisure time with interest and entertainment, and nature particularly, and you can see this all over social media, as something that is cute. Now, a couple of months ago, I think it was just before Christmas, I came across on my social media account this slide. No, it was actually a video, I should say, about cutest baby sloth ever. And it was showing this little baby sloth in the arms of a zookeeper being shown, you know, and I think it was done as a scientific documentary, but the whole tenor was about, oh, look at how cute. Oh, isn't it cute that he's raising his claws in this way? Isn't it cute? Oh, look, he's trying to high five me. And I saw this and I actually felt such a shock. My shock and dissociation upon seeing this video came because I just come from spending months of immersion into reading about sloths by a Goethean scientist called Mark Holdridge, who brought us a picture of the sloth in its natural environment, where every detail, every quality described, he says, speaks of the sloth, of slothness. And I had built up over this time this imaginative picture of the sloth as being completely at one in its environment, to the point of seeing it out of its environment and being only displayed for entertainment purposes felt like a shock of complete wrongness. It wasn't a moral judgment, it wasn't a feeling of, oh, you know, this could be harmful or it should be treated in this way. It was simply a sense of wrongness, and that I actually felt, this is wrong. And this, one can say, these concepts such as cuteness and enemy are extensions of this separation of the human from the world that an analytic science view of the world has brought us to. Neil stated yesterday that Husserl argued that objectivity arose out of subjectivity. And you might say this happens when we step back from the world rather than towards it. We bring about this separation of the subjectivity of being in the world, and we bring objectivity by stepping away from the world. And this is what I think that, or I decided perhaps that Stuart was talking about yesterday when he talked about the ungroundable facts of science, that they are literally, when one steps away from the world, They are literally not grounded in the world. So how can it be different? In Goethean science, or in phenomenology, which is Goethean science is a phenomenological approach, unlike in theory-building methodologies, the aim is to bring oneself closer to the phenomenon as directly as possible, rather than stepping back from it to objectively observe it. When we step closer to the world, we become, as Goethe says, at home with it through a process of observation, repeated observations where we immerse ourselves in the phenomenon of the other in order to learn to know its qualities, a process that is one of gradual disclosure that leads us to the phenomenon's essential being. Goethean phenomenology is, in fact, a qualitative, not a quantitative approach to science, aimed at providing an epistemological rather than ontological understanding of a phenomenon. It was originally directed towards science rather than psychology, towards nature rather than humans. But like traditional phenomenology, it emphasizes immersion in the world through direct experiential contact, through observation. But for Goethe, observation is not what we think of as an everyday scene, but a type of beholding, a term that he uses in the sense of contemplating receptively. Beholding goes beyond ordinary observation to a perceptual encounter that reveals the patterns or essence of the phenomenon, like a seeing of the mind, Holdridge describes it. It is an unfolding observational process of nature, one that aims at understanding and not at explanation. Not of explanation and not of reduction either. Goethe, in a sense, foreshadowed Merleau-Ponty by emphasizing perception as being primary to his approach, as a way of disclosing the world through developing new eyes for it. Through beholding the world, we can, as Goethe says, become utterly identical with the object. A well-known example of this, often cited in non-phenomenological works, is that of geneticist Barbara McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize for her work on corn chromosomes. And she described experiencing a similar sort of intimacy as Goethe describes after long hours spent studying corn chromosomes through a microscope, an experience she described as leading to a develop of a kind of intuitive thinking in her, and there was the basis of her Nobel Prize winning work. This interpenetration of self and world leads to a restructuring of consciousness, says Goethe. This interpenetration of self and world leads, to a transformation through phenomenological seeing and experiencing. Merleau-Ponty similarly hinted at consciousness being restructured through his concept of radical reflection, a notion that approaches that, in some ways, of that of the Eastern contemplative tradition, where consciousness itself is not only directed towards the phenomenon, but is shaped or even transformed by it. In this way, the duality of the mind-body distinction is then dissolved. Although Goethean phenomenology orients to the study of nature, not to humans, Robbins considers that the Goethean approach, in fact, closes the gap between these two fields, as its approach to observation is also a path of self-discovery for the researcher. Its particular significance in this broader context is that it provides an enlightening understanding of the direct experience, in fact, of how to capture it more directly. To do this, one must go back upstream, as Henry Bortoff calls it, back upstream into the experiencing of the experience, into the appearing of the appearance. Phenomenology here, therefore, shifts the attention from within the experience, from what is experienced downstream, back into the experiencing of what is experienced, says Bortoff. The phenomenon is not only something that appears, but it appears as appearing. Being means appearing, says Heidegger. meaning not what appears, but upstream of what appears, within the happening of the appearing. In this way, seeing becomes a coming into being experience of a phenomenon. The phenomenon then is experienced as a dynamic unfolding event, not something that is already past and fixed. So what I want to do now is look at a couple of particular examples of Goethean phenomenology in practice. So the first one, so Neil, I think this morning in his paper looked at the plant world. So I want to look at two phenomenological studies on the animal and on the human world. So let's return to the sloth. So this is a drawing by the Goethean scientist Mark Holdridge illustrating his description of his phenomenological studies into the sloth. And this is, as it says, the three-toed sloth, where one can see the sloth as a picture of the organic lawfulness inherent in one animal. So Holdridge provides in his description a very long, complex, very detailed account of the sloth, but the sloth in its world and not separate from it. So he talks about the fur that turns green in places where the algae, it picks up algae and algae starts to grow in its fur. He talks about the limbs from which its body hangs, because it is basically an animal that must live in the trees. He talks about its temperature, its diet, its metabolism, its trademark slow movement. Holdridge notes that the sloth is so particularly blends with its environment through its colours and movements, and also through its changing bodily temperature, which changes in accordance, not through its own activity, but in accordance with the ambient temperature of its environments. And so in this way that the sloth cannot be understood, truly understood, as separate from its environment. And it is not that the sloth is, he says, is slow, so much that it stretches time. Even its feces decompose incredibly slowly, providing a slow, gradual source of nutrition for the forest, from the ground and into the forest. So the sloth in its habitat is a habitat in itself. Apart from the usual mites, fleas and beetles, there's a special type of moth that lives in its fur. They are not parasitic, they get their food elsewhere, and the algae lives in its fur. So the sloth is an environment in itself, but one so intimately connected with the forest, so in tune with it, that taken out of its habitat, as I saw in this video and in all the cute sloth social media accounts, that when taken out of its environment, you take away its essential slothness. Just some excerpts from his description of the sloth. And what happens when the sloth isn't in its natural terrestrial environment, but on rough surfaces and in captivity and in people's homes when they keep pet sloths, it's actually extremely difficult, in fact, for the sloth to crawl along. So, as it says, the sloth can only drag its body in finding a hole for its claws. And because the sloth in its true environment is essentially an animal that spends its whole life in the trees, hanging from the branches. Even its fur tells us that instead of having a part on the mid-back, with the hair running towards the belly, as is typical with terrestrial animals, the sloth's fur has a part mid-belly and the hair runs back towards the back. So viewed in this way, the sloth tree, sloth moth, and the algae are all part of one another. So this picture that Holdridge paints, this picture of the sloth in the context of environment, he says that the whole lights up through the parts. And as Bortos says, the way to the whole is through the parts. The whole is nowhere to be encountered except in the midst of its parts. And these parts in the sloth are completely integrated with its environment. So, as I said, this having immersed myself in this description of the sloth over several months, where I'd filmed this inner picture of sloth and as being completely one in the forest, this is just then explains my sense of wrongness when I saw the sloth and taken out of its environment. It had lost something of that essential being. So I want to now look at another example of phenomenological studies. So I want to look at, bring to you briefly something about the application of Goethean phenomenology to the human world, starting, however, with the work of another Goethean scientist called Theodor Schwenk, and his work on qualitative natural water flow studies, which I actually used as a launching pad for my own phenomenological study for my doctoral dissertation on thinking, which was particularly focused on the nature, on the experience of thinking during creative activity. So when we look at this verse in his book on his studies, Theodor Schwenk says the activity of thinking is essentially an expression of flowing movement. Only when thinking dwells on a particular content, a particular form, does it order itself accordingly and create an idea. Every idea, like every organic form, arises from a process of flow until the movement congeals into a form. Therefore, we speak of a capacity to think fluently when someone is skillfully able to carry out this creation of form in thought, harmoniously coordinating the stream of thoughts and progressing from one idea to the other. Thinking that cannot enter deeply enough into every detail becomes, in fact, a flight of ideas torn along as though by an invisible torrent, which can create no permanent forms. On the other hand, thinking that becomes solidified in fixed ideas remains captive of form without being able to develop towards further possibilities. So this imaginative metaphor of thinking, which in fact to Schwenk wasn't in fact a metaphor at all, but in fact a reality. From this one, Schwenk was inspired by his, this imaginative picture, this kind of a shape of the way of thinking in a dynamic form, was inspired by his qualitative investigation into natural water flow. His studies revealed that the form of water in the natural environment has an intrinsic ebb and flow that is more than simply a flow of energy. It has an expressive curvilinear gestures such that meander, spiral and oscillate, and yet a rhythm that is following a law towards the spherical shape of the water droplet. But his analogy of water flow with thinking is more than just poetic. As I said, he based this aesthetic imagery on his meticulous experimentation and phenomenological observation of water processes in nature, imbuing his empirical methods with this metaphoric imagination that arose from his descriptions from immersing himself in his observations of water flow. The foundation of this concept is that the activity of thinking has the same meander gesture as water flow. In water, natural forms arrive out of weaving strands of flowing movement. Sorry. They are shaped by water's intrinsic dynamic interplay with external constraints such as rocks, twigs, the banks of a river that act as a resisting force, resulting in one complex, multi-stranded dynamic movement, such as one. So this is a photo of one of his experiments of drawing a sharp object through oil in water, and these are the forms that in fact are left afterwards. So this is not only then one might say that this is shows a picture of natural water flow, but this is the visual image of how Schwenk conceptualized dynamic thinking. So in the same way, thought forms, ideas, gradually arise in the process of our thinking, says Schwenk, due to the tension that arises through a similar dissolve and bind process as we think. This presents us with an experiential picture of thinking process as an ever-evolving stream of flow and resistance that embodies both order and chaos, continuity and discontinuity. Our thinking, when in full flow, should in fact be experienced as this dynamic, living, streaming movement active in our inner being. So conceptualizing thinking in terms of fluidity is, however, not unique to Schwenk. We're all familiar with the phrases like the flow of thought within the stream of consciousness. But Schwenk deepened and extended this picture when, through his qualitative water experiments, he demonstrated that nature exists as one whole being, and human thinking, when enlivened through immersive, repeated beholdings, when our perception is enlivened, when we step closer to the world rather than away from it, can connect us to this being of nature and be part of it. Schwenk's descriptive lived experience understanding of how we think and process our ideas demonstrates a far more integrated understanding of human thinking than traditional science, which takes a dualist stance to cognition and in fact to the human being itself, seeking to explain cognition in isolation from general human experience, separating thinking into types such as the intuitive versus logical, or critical versus creative. Further, such dualistic approaches characterize the structure of thinking as a step process in a line of thought. By contrast, Schwenk's image of thinking as a dynamic, continually recursive, multi-stranded interplay of two opposing forces of interaction sees the quality of thinking's movement with its multi-string thickness as important as the structure of the thinking itself. His holistic position sees cognition as part of human experience rather than being distinct from it, seeing the parts, always presencing the whole. Schwenk saw the human being as dynamically interacting with the world through perception, cognition, and experience in ways that cannot be abstracted into theory. I'd just like to say at this point that Schwenk's conception of thinking as an experience of flow and resistance was clearly demonstrated in my doctoral thesis, when I looked at the phenomenological study of cognitive processing during dynamic activity. In my research, I wanted to not just take a closer look at a very popular theory of creativity called flow thinking. I not only wanted to take a closer look at that in relation to the concept of creativity, but to look at it in relationship to the way people thinking and processing as they create, as they engage in the process. So not just their thoughts about it afterwards, not just their recollections of the experience, which often become as stories they tell about themselves in interviews that they have woven their memories into. But I wanted to actually look at the appearing of those thoughts and feelings as they happened. And just as Schwenk took a closer look at the qualities of water through observation and experiment, so I looked very closely at what people were actually experiencing in their experiencing as they were creating. Furthermore, to do this, I used Bortoff's approach of going back upstream, so to speak, from the experience to try to capture the direct experience in its appearing in order to understand what actually was the experience in its experience as it appeared. So thinking, when enlivened by the seeing with the mind's eye that Goethe called beholding, can be, in fact, a dynamic experience with the capacity to revise and disrupt, dissolve and bind the underlying patterns that govern our habitual patterns of thought processing. In this way, we can not only experience our thinking process in connection with the dynamic living world around us, but it means we are open and cognizant to what the world is speaking to us. And then I've just, as the philosopher Rudolf Steiner says, who was a Goethe scholar, as long as a person does not feel the working and creating of an idea, his thinking will always remain separate from nature. So, to conclude this presentation, so having given those different examples of the application of Goethean phenomenology to the animal world, to water, flow, and very briefly, though I didn't really go into it, to my work on the practice on the experience of cognitive processing, I'd just like to draw attention to how Goethean phenomenology could also act as a cultural therapeutic. So, and this work comes in fact from a psychologist, Brent Dean Robbins, who was very inspired by Goethe's approach to observing and understanding nature. Robbins says that the aim of a cultural therapeutic is to own up to our obligations, that which is unconscious but continues to claim us in our technological world. It is a matter of making explicit those responses to the world that are covered over or concealed by layers of culture, which nevertheless continue to call us and which remain accessible only through careful, critically engaged description of a phenomenon. The process of owning up to our obligations is one that can be a healing process, a process of coming home to ourselves, as Goethe might have said. In this way, it is therapeutic. So Goethe's method of science is a form, he says, of cultural therapeutic, because it offers arguably not only a different approach to science than modern science, but it offers a style of understanding nature that is therapeutic. And when one says that Goethe offers a therapeutic approach to nature, what he means is that the process of studying nature is one that is potentially transformative for the researcher, for the scientist, for the observer. This is not an approach to nature which says that being in nature is good for me because of how it makes me feel, but one where we learn to perceive the beingness of nature through this process of stepping closer to it and learning its secrets. It is a therapeutic process because it is one that may potentially restore to health and wholeness those who would practice it. It is a cultural therapeutic because it is taken up as a cultural practice, and as a cultural worldview, it may in fact be curative and restorative for our entire culture. There is no question that for Goethe, observation, or beholding as he called it, has in its aim the development of the observer, who in the process of clear and careful description of the object under investigation is in the process of schooling their own faculties. So Goethean phenomenology then can close the gap between natural science and the humanities, since both come to share the task of schooling our faculties and cultivating understanding. So the natural sciences and the human sciences can become united because the observation of nature is always, or should always be, a process of self-discovery. And through that self-discovery, we may come better to realise more sustainable practices of living with nature and with each other. So just to finish, I'd just like to leave you with something from Merleau-Ponty. In his last unfinished work, Merleau-Ponty extends the human-centred being towards a being that entwines with the natural world when he begins calling unreflected experience the brute or wild being that can never be fully articulated, never be fully expressed, never captured in its essence. And yet the phenomenologist must always aim towards that, towards capturing that which cannot be captured. For Merleau-Ponty, being becomes a thing which has yet to attain the status of an object and yet cannot do so. This increasing awareness of the unresolvable contradiction inherent in a phenomenological approach suggests a much more radical response than perhaps the more scientific transcendental approach of Husserl and his interpreters, and very far from the everyday life worlds of hermeneutic phenomenologists. Because it hints at silence, at ineffability, at something right at the edge of what can be humanly expressed or even grasped. For Merleau-Ponty, language becomes not only the voice of humans, but the very voice of things, the waves and the forests, that the world itself has agency and its own intentions that call upon us to respond, draws a certain parallel with this belief of Merleau-Ponty's, that in this belief that in language is the very voice of things. Thank you. Any questions? Any comments?
Thank you, Fiona. That was wonderful. I really loved that. I so much food for thought, and what comes to me straight away is really involving oneself in the process, and you pointed out right at the beginning with that so-called cute sloth, that actually distances one from the life of creatures. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
I think that has so many implications for phenomenology and my own area of people with dementia. I think that picture of the sloth really speaks to me, because it's what we do with people when they have dementia as well. We don't live into their world. We don't try to seek the phenomena and to really observe what's happening for those people. So it's a very valuable insight for me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I really like the comparison between the two ways of thinking about the sloth. That was fantastic. I'm very concerned about people and their relationship to dogs as well, like the whole way that we perceive dogs in our current life. It's quite bizarre, and it seems like we're domesticating ourselves through them or something. I don't know, but there's something weird going on, and I liked it a lot. I like that you're articulating that, because it's like a false relationship with nature.
Yeah, as someone who's been spent the past couple of months pet sitting for people as they go away, I can really relate to that. How they present their pets, their cats, their dogs, their birds, even their lizard to you as, you know, something that doesn't really seem to have much connection to it being a dog or a cat. Yeah, more like a stuffed toy or something. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thinking about dogs is very interesting, because there's been such a process of co-evolution with dogs. So it's actually hard to think of them as in any way disentangleable from us. And what's interesting about that is, of course, is that, you know, we've been partly shaped by dogs in the way that we've become what we are. Because my observations are, I think people very rarely talk about their dogs as stuffed animals. I think there's a very interesting interspecial intercorporeality that we have with our dogs. I often, with my students, talk about how I feel like I know my dog's skull and its musculature better than I know my own, because I spend so much time with my hands sort of immersed in the materiality of the dog. So I think there's a lot to think about there. But yeah, similarly, I think those observations about the sloth and the putting alight the idea that a species can be defined by its DNA, for example, rather than the complex, the complex sort of shading into an interpenetration with a totality. It's a great thing to think about. Thinking about the violence that we do to animals when we take them out of those thick engagements with place. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm thinking about that because, you know, as you were talking, my dog was nudging up against my legs and making a fuss and, you know, negotiating his own being with us. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, well, my comment does come based on my lived experience of 20 house sits in the past 18 months. So I can show you quite a range of relationships to dogs and cats. So, but I think with as you said at the beginning, the dog is so separated. I mean, it's the domestic animal. We can't really talk about it in the same way as the sloth.
No. I think that's my point, but it's actually, you know, I don't think I think the notion of domesticated dog is actually an oxymoron or a tautology, you know, but it creates a false distinction between the idea of a domestic dog and a wild dog. Dogs as we have them are always part of us. Anyway, that's just a flight of...
Yeah.
Hi, Elise here. Sorry for dropping in late. Thank you so much, Fiona. That was so interesting. Just talking about the idea of animals and our relationship with them and interdependence and coevolution. I just wanted to throw out there to you guys some research that a friend of mine's been doing at the University of Flinders in Adelaide with microbes and the consciousness of microbes. And his name's Martin Breed. He works more in a scientific capacity and in terms of biophilia, which is what I'm studying at the moment for my PhD. But he looks at the idea that our consciousness as humans is actually partially dictated by the consciousness of the microbes that inhabit us as within the human biome. And he's done some fascinating research that depending on which microbes are in your body, for instance, if you eat a lot of broccoli, there's evidence to suggest that you will be attracted to broccoli because the microbes in our bodies are literally affecting the way we perceive the world and drawing us towards more broccoli. There's another example with mice becoming addicted to the smell of cat urine. So these mice, for complicated reasons, seek out cat urine and because of the microbes in their bodies, and they start to do really dangerous activities, risky activities, and put themselves in danger because the microbes want to, you know, propagate their species. Not obviously want to, but are driven to through evolutionary forces, blah, 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 without getting into the whole argument of did we get evolution right? But anyway, so these microbes actually can also appear in humans. These same microbes that drive mice to want to undertake these dangerous activities will drive humans so to want to undertake daredevil behavior. So I guess I just want to throw out to a group of phenomenologists who are all experts, as you all are, in the field of consciousness, or no, Stuart, you don't like that word, but whatever. Sorry, I'm not a phenomenologist, I don't know the correct term, but whatever you guys would say. And I'm just intrigued as to how would you approach from your perspective the idea of our interdependence and co-creation through our daily experience with microbial entities? Sorry, that's a really weird question, but is it something that you think about, or is it just a human consciousness?
Were you here when I just mentioned the work of Barbara McClintock, the geneticist?
I might have been, yeah.
Yeah, because she spent so much time looking at through the microscope, looking at corn chromosomes, that she said that she actually experienced herself down there amongst the corn chromosomes.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and it was through that becoming feeling herself to be at one with them, being, that interpenetration of herself with the corn chromosomes. It was out of that she was able to write her Nobel Prize winning work on the subject. So, I mean, that's quite amazing, isn't it, to think of that?
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, thank you. I'll look into that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm really interested in those sorts of ideas, partly come from the same place as Stuart, as sort of wanting to critique the idea of consciousness as a pure phenomenon. But, one of the initial impulses of phenomenology was to think in terms of intentionality, of direction of perception and engagement. And I think that's a useful way to start thinking about what might be happening with less complex organisms as well. So I feel very uncomfortable about talking about bacterial consciousness, but intentionality would seem to be a different kind of question. And of course, there's a whole stream of thinking in theory of consciousness about under what conditions of complexity might certain intentional states of different organisms build to something that we might recognise as consciousness. A lot of it kind of unresolved. There's a great thinker, I think his name is Will Strawson, who advocates for a kind of almost a pantheistic, now what's the word? A universal consciousness. So to actually, and this guy isn't out there. He's a philosopher, sort of saying it's no less mysterious to talk about a kind of proto-intentional something that pervades the universe. It's no less freaky to talk about that than it is to talk about subatomic particles in the way that physicists do. So, by the time we start talking about spin in quarks, that's a complete mystery. And so Strawson's part of the argument is that simply saying consciousness emerges out of complexity actually doesn't answer the question about what is there in the initial state of things that might let that happen. So I think that's really interesting. So for me personally, as a phenomenologist, that started being a moment where, when I started reading that work, where the world started shimmering at me in a different way.
Right.
Because suddenly the whole world is constituted by these intentionalities. And so, what a cat does when they come up and hit my leg with their head strikes me as not being about thinking in the way that I think, although it's a lot like the way that I might be in the world when I'm not thinking, which is the way that I'm in the world a lot of the time, I think. Anyway, so I'm just, when we start talking about the bacterial stuff, I think you triggered me. But it's also interesting to hear how quickly we fall into what Whitehead would call a fallacy of misplaced concreteness, when we start attributing want or desire or agency to bacteria as well. So,
Ian, can we have consciousness without language?
Yes, I think we can, Vras.
Language is the house of being. If you have no language that has being, if you are homeless, houseless in this.
Well, then the question,
the formlessness of them. The Buddhists and the Eastern Orthodox believe that after you repeat certain things, the soul dissolves and it becomes this formless, goes into this formless state, the state of formlessness. Can we go there?
Yes, so your question is about what constitutes a language, isn't it?
Many forms of language, not verbal language. I mean, you know,
so you know, my dog shouting at me in the morning to open the door is clearly a form of zoosemiotics, and you know, I'm quite happy for him to have consciousness attributed to him.
Don't bring Wittgenstein to that, because we don't have a dictionary for that, right? We don't have a dictionary for that language, so we can't talk, even if they
yeah.
don't have.
Well, I guess I am too much the Wittgensteinian then. Okay. I'll start working on my dog language dictionary.
Very good, very good.
Sorry.
All right. We can't.
You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, we need to wrap that up because we need to go on to Paolo. Yeah, so if everyone can mute themselves, and then we'll go to the next presentation. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see my screen and hear my voice?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Firstly, I feel very honored to be able to speak here today. So thank you, Neil, for the invitation. It's great to be amongst such an interesting group of thinkers. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging on this land where I am, the Dharawal and the Durag. I'm in southwest Sydney. So yeah, so who am I? My name is Paolo, and I come from a background in design and architecture. That's in a way the way I see the world, often through that kind of frame. But yeah, I guess why I'm excited about design and architecture stems from an experience as a young child which I had creating cubby houses, playing with spaces, those times of really being amongst materials and within landscapes. I would go as far as to say that's why I care about the state of the planet in the face of this climate chaos. So yeah, my presentation will be visual, in accordance with the dominant visual culture of the eye of today. These are some screenshots I took yesterday during the presentation at different times of the day. So I just want to ask a few rhetorical questions about how we experience time. So first, I'd like to state that my lower body experienced the day and my eyes experienced the talk because they were shaded and I was able to view the screen. So how do we experience time? Was my time different from those of you who participated in talks indoors? Was time similar for those of you who were indoors? Because you could see the shadows moving on the bricks behind me, did that unify our experience of time? How can we quantify what we observe? So yeah, as you can see, the shadow on the bricks behind, I've kind of tried to highlight with the diagram. So necessary architecture is not translated experience. In my perspective, it actually is experience. It is a presencing, enabling human participatory actions. However, we can still ask questions of what it represents in acknowledgement of the fact that human experience is also valuably mediated linguistically. Here is a ceiling module that I designed and built out of birchwood, and that interior extrusion that you can see of the perforated wood was in a way a subjective gesture that I've then analyzed with the ruler in the background quantitatively. That's what this image is showing. Within this current time of climate chaos, architecture has the potential to play a pivotal role in identifying our challenges because I believe of its innately dualistic nature. The intrinsic play between science and art, between the body and the city, between the mind and the house, between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between ornamentation and utilitarian objectives, between less and more, and between the poet and the engineer. So I believe it is this tension that gives it its power, and that's where architecture plays its pivotal role in this challenge of the climate we're facing. This is an image of, so this is an image of me contemplating what kind of threshold this might have been to experience 3,000 years ago. And this is the gateway to the temple of Karnak in ancient Thebes in Luxor, Egypt. It is necessary, however, to acknowledge the common origin of the tradition of architecture, which has resulted from the technological world, especially in relation to some of the generative theories I will present today. The cause of architecture, however, must transform in response to the ascendency of scientific orthodoxy, which excludes being itself from the terms of inquiry, as this symposium obviously seeks to explore. As architects, the narratives we design and build, the narratives from experience to form, I believe must aspire to radically different ethics in response to the technological world we have created. So I believe solutions lie not in the eradication necessarily of the technological world, but rather in a kind of reorienting of our destiny, where layers of experience can open up more critical methods of inquiry into experiences of being, which can lead to addressing the climate chaos of our time more successfully. So these are some technical drawings from Switzerland, a project that I was part of. You know, a lot of precision in this work, and it's got a particular form of expression. And it's interesting when you put that alongside what we were speaking about yesterday of it also being a place of direct democracy. It's the same place. I'm just putting that out there as well. So in order to make effective choices about our experience, and destiny, to bring up some idea with language. And he speaks of a story where trees rubbed together and the fire was created, and this was kind of the origins. I won't go too far into it because I don't have much time, but architecture in a way started to reflect the order of the cosmos, numerical proportions and ratios. During the 19th century, a disconnect began to emerge from cosmology. So we see this in Edmund Husserl's critique, I believe, that Niels brought up for this symposium. This interdisciplinary symposium. So I think the pathway of the discipline of architecture began to lose its reference from cosmology and became more separate and secularized its journey through the different stages of modernism and postmodernism. So yeah, this is an allegorical engraving of the Vitruvian primitive hut. Now the role of the architect has become that of the narrator, according to Alberto Perez Gomez, and I'd like to quote him. In significant work of the last 2 centuries, the architect has indeed become a narrator of events, disclosing fictional modes of dwelling by deconstructing and twisting the language of technology, both in constructions, questioning reductive tools of representation, and through words, questioning functional programming. So this is a collage I created whilst in the Netherlands, trying to address a design situation for a town called in Den Bosch. So on the left-hand side is a plan of the city center of Den Bosch, and on the right-hand side is a plan of Rome. And I brought them together to kind of raise questions about how the original planner of this city in the Netherlands took ideas from Rome and how we might bring them back into a discussion about the architecture that would emerge in this city. So this is just a play that initiated a design I'm sharing. But yeah, how can architecture retrieve its state of presence and embody more authentic values? So a really interesting writer by the name of Jani Palasma, he's from Finland. He writes about architecture and the seven senses. And within his writing, he, it's actually this book here, he speaks a lot about retinal architecture, where due to the hurried nature of grasping the world through the lens of the camera, we begin to separate ourselves from the world. We begin to behold the world almost as spectators. We often remain at this distance instead of real immersion into the experience of being in the world. So in turn, much of architecture can become isolated in this distant realm of vision, which Palasma speaks of, this separation between constructed realities of matter. And as a result, architecture, to quote him, becomes like a stage where the authenticity, in my belief, this authenticity or truth of the materials is lost. So I believe the world around us starts to deceive us. I believe when the world around us starts to deceive us, we begin to mistrust it, mirroring in our own behaviors and moral qualities and morality, qualities of deception or indifference to the authenticity of truth. So this collage that I've got up on the screen is by a man called Rem Koolhaas, a very well-known architect, and he made this collage for the Biennale in Venice, and it's showing architecture from different parts of the world in 1914. And we can kind of recognize the styles reflected in the buildings, the regionalism, let's say, of the forms. And then you fast forward 100 years, in 2014, and again, we're looking at these countries. And again, we're looking at certain buildings. And I know this is framed and this is staged, but he's trying to say something about what remains of national styles today and how we actually got here in this collage. So yeah, this is the book where a lot of the ideas I'm speaking about come from. Jani Palasma. So I'd like to, for our own contemplation, I'd like to quote him. He says, "I confront the city with my body. My legs measure the length of the arcade and the width of the square. My gaze unconsciously projects my body onto the facade of the cathedral, where it roams over the moldings and contours, sensing the size of recesses and projections. My body weight meets the mass of the cathedral door, and my hand grasps the door full as I enter the dark void beyond. I experience myself in the city, and the city exists through my embodied experience. The city and my body supplement and define each other. I dwell in the city, and the city dwells in me." This is one of the famous images of the climate crisis, obviously, that affected New South Wales, which we're all pretty much aware of. These are a couple of images from a property that my family owns, where we can see similar times of the year and the contrasting weather patterns in these two images. One was during the bushfires, obviously. And when we look to the advice of the Australia's National Environmental Science Program, we obviously see human-caused climate change, or ideas that to quote them, human-caused climate change has resulted in more dangerous weather conditions for bushfires in the recent decades for many regions of Australia. And they go on to say how these trends will continue due to increasing greenhouse gases. So, and you look to the scientific community, you look at the global community, and the IPCC states that scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And we reach this point of being certain through evidence for rapid climate change, which is compelling, and it can be seen in global temperature rise, warming oceans, shrinking ice sheets, glacial retreat, decreased snow cover, sea level rise, declining Arctic ice, extreme events that we experienced this summer, and obviously, not necessarily obviously, but also ocean acidification. This is a graph showing just atmospheric samples contained in ice cores up until the 1950s, and then we see the big spike. So how might we act in the face of this climate chaos? What are the solutions when we establish that there is a problem and it is coming from us as humans? So there are many solutions. These are some of the solutions from a book called Drawdown. It's called The Most Comprehensive Plan Ever Proposed to Reverse Global Warming, and it's by a man by the name of Paul Hawken. And within it, there's an international coalition of researchers and professionals and scientists that come together to offer a set of realistic, bold solutions to climate change. There's actually 100 techniques and practices that are described, and they range from solar farms to educating girls to practices that pull carbon out of our air, and obviously also importantly for this land, indigenous people's land management. So I believe we can only address the climate change technologically if we allow ourselves to experience a layer of being broad enough wherein we can exercise sharing the feelings of the other, to empathetically experience and experience this interconnected web we inhabit through reflective and iterative action. We cannot mitigate climate change without including a more extensive notion of being to our experience of the world. And obviously being is a word with an extraordinary career behind it, which has been developed and which we've been speaking about these last few days. So I don't necessarily fully comprehend it, but I tried to make it a graph to draw out my understanding of this situation between what we see in terms of science having these solutions. So I believe all the solutions are out there, and the denial of these solutions is seen in the way we act towards the planet. So science tells us that there's a problem, tells us how to solve it, through solar farms, through this whole range of solutions, and yet we still deny science and technology. So in a general sense, I'm speaking obviously in this graph. So how can our actions to the planet change? And I believe, after considering this idea of being due to this symposium, I can see that this layer of experience, which I've highlighted in yellow, or being, if we were to truly experience solar power in a different way than just reading about it in a textbook or seeing it within a book, if we were to experience solar power in a different way, how might our leaders act towards the planet? If they're in experience of these solutions which do exist in science, could they truly act the way they act if they were to have experienced these situations of the world in a different way. Scott Morrison, for instance, could he still say what he says if he were to have experienced coal in a different sense? Okay, so obviously these are a list of some of the solutions. Again, I'm going to talk about how I've addressed some of them, or tried to address some of them. I'm going to speak about just two of them pretty shortly, but the first one is to do with food, farmland restoration, agriculture, and the idea of why bother. So I hosted so rather than reacting to the world by saying I have all the solutions, I decided to host a process, which I've undertaken a few times in different parts of the world, trying to mediate and co-create between global and local languages of design. So creating a kind of workshop where I asked the question of what makes a place. This is a workshop that took place in Egypt recently. And the idea is to look at, much like what Stuart brought up earlier with his idea, with what he does with theatre. So I've kind of formed this set of this kind of workshop which plays on ideas that do exist from a whole range of thinkers and notions, but I've kind of brought it forth in a certain way, where I host this kind of series of events. And the first one is this idea of how can we bring an atmosphere into a piece of clay, and then what would happen if two people had a dialogue instead of using words, instead of using language, if these individual atmospheres that were brought into the clay, they could have been brought into the clay through thinking or through feeling. So without defining this initial atmosphere, then how could they have a dialogue? So I encourage the two participants to have a dialogue. And then also, I definitely like some of the ideas of Goethe, where how can we start to observe these forms from more objective sense to a more subjective sense. So I think Goethe speaks about these ways of observation, and I don't know them that well, but I think in essence it's moving from like exact sense perceptions to exact sensual imagination. I'm sure someone could speak to this with more accuracy, and this idea of seeing and beholding, and then what happens when you start to become the object or become the tree or become the leaf and observe it in that sense, much like I guess people do in the realm of theatre. And then what happens when the two meet as four, and then what happens when we enter these forms through writing, through poetry, imagining the space, assigning these forms functional, real world functions, let's say. So the clay form becomes the swimming pool, and the swimming pool is placed next to the mosque, for instance. So this process is forming between participants. And then I'm really interested also by theatre as well, and people by the likes of Otto Schama, where he plays with ideas of presencing theatre. What would happen if someone were to take this group took up the role in their bodies of different stakeholders, and yes, some interesting ideas definitely emerged in this particular workshop with some young farmers, and yeah, what did emerge was moments of presence, moments of being between materials, science and art, people and knowledge and intuition. And it kind of became a merging play, which yielded some great results for some of the farmers and engineers in understanding spatial, cultural, racial, gendered relationships and proposing some solutions, essentially. But obviously it was more about the process. Okay, I'll quickly speak to another project. This is a project called curved gill ceiling, and I made it with an exploration into volume and light, applying an approach of material thinking, so experiencing wood in the sense of through touch, through bending, through allowing the material to speak in a different way to how we could otherwise design spaces. Let's say in a more subjective sense, allowing something more poetic to emerge, and then applying the real world constraints or the rigor of functionality of this space, creating a ceiling structure, and then using this perforated wood to control the direction of light, applying it to a space in Tusculum, the Australian Institute of Architects there, and ideally for a gallery which promotes wood as a sustainable material. So to address the climate crisis from the perspective of material, proposing this kind of, eventually the space that was proposed was a more passive, sort of a passive building where I proposed, I made some one-to-one models of these modules, which were kind of mechanically operated, but I proposed that wax paraffin cylinders could be used to open and close these modules, so the building could breathe as the temperature would change. In a hot day, the wax would melt, so then potentially a module could close and then therefore limit the amount of light to enter the space, and yeah, a sustainable functional solution to address this climate crisis potentially. That was the aim, and it obviously is a bit clunky, but yeah, and I'd like to conclude with this sentence these paragraphs that I wrote. We are the instrument through which form continually comes into the world, created anew, and through our own initiative, we have the ability to refine the changing relationships between the individual, ourselves, and the habitat we choose, hopefully challenging us to tune into the rhythms of existence that matter on our path. As we zoom into this relationship between individuality and habitat and try to move towards interventions with ecological sensitivity, we must look at what these forms are shaping. And I believe it's not the cement, bricks, or wood. It is atmosphere and life itself. Design's power of conscious sculpting of our habitat is just an attempt to put at the innermost core of the habitat we choose the force of atmosphere and life. And that's all. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you.
It's so great to see someone young and intelligent with technological skills, but also with the awareness to create a diaphragm in the building. I think it's beautiful. So all the best of luck with all of your endeavors. You obviously tested it out. You've got a lot of skills and you're not afraid to approach the world in a different way. So good on you.
Thank you, Harrington. Thank you very much.
Hello, it's Jan. I'd just like to say it's wonderful that last section that you showed of your intense, immersive relationship with wood, which allowed you then to think about the architectural designs that you would do. I mean, it's often that we don't see that with architects. We don't see the relationship that they have to the materials that are going to constitute their buildings. And I think because of what you've done there, you've opened up new possibilities for the way that we can see architecture. In terms of your earlier discussion, it made me think of the Australian philosopher Elizabeth Gross, who said, architecture is the framing of chaos. So we can't think about our world without that frame. So when we think about the world, we think about architecture as well. And that goes for our idea of nature as well, which we also frame. So beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Paolo, I don't know, are you aware of the work of Paolo Soleri?
I have been, but he hasn't been part of my thoughts recently.
His archaeology, it's exactly about how architectural form coexists with ecology in order to create this incredible, what he called democratic society, that we can't have democratic societies without architecture and ecology being incorporated. What do you think about this idea?
Yeah, I definitely.
Archaeology as a sense of the beginning. He used the word of, just this kind of we have to reform the way that cities have been made, of course, right? We have sort of a kind of, but don't you think that cities in their inhumanity have a great mystique?
Sorry, in their, could you say that again?
Humanity and the dehumanizing, just function. They have a great mystique, can't they? Don't they? You can't understand Russia, the tyranny of Russia, without Petersburg. The tyrannical totalitarian systems without these big, enormous cities. It's the difference between Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem in traditional terms, right? You have this huge, enormous architecture in Rome. You have this smaller democratic principle in Athens, and the invisibility of space in the Jewish tradition. How do we respond today to this ecological, challenges? Do we frame architectural space? Can we do it?
So I definitely think there can never really be a theory of architecture. Like as soon as we try to say what it should be, it again loses its value. And Plasma speaks often about how we share with the architecture, with our environment, we share our very flesh. So in a sense, with that earlier comment, I dwell in the city and the city dwells in me, or I believe we can remember who we were when we look to different forms, or what we were thinking, or let's say of strange structures that don't necessarily make sense. So I think they speak of maybe who we were yesterday, and then when we create something different, we might say who we want to become. So I think there's an interplay between the forms and what we hope to become or aspire to.
What did you feel when you went to Karnak?
Yeah, interesting. I tried to feel into the past. I mean, I felt, yeah, it's an interesting question. At that gateway, it was particularly special. I mean, my body looked up, so the architecture made me look up. It made my body do certain things that I can acknowledge. The heat made me position myself relative to the shadow in a certain way. I saw things I didn't understand, but they kind of made me wonder what it would be like to experience that in the past, and is it necessarily the same or not, So yeah, I felt a few things. I haven't really reflected on it, to be honest, but yeah.
But your photograph was very eloquent, I think. Just the enormity of the threshold, because essentially, if we go back to the Heideggerian idea, a door is a threshold as well. It's not simply a passage, but a threshold as well. Just there. And I mean, Karnak is such a weird place, isn't it? You feel that there's something sort of kind of. When I went there, I felt that my stomach was upset. Very few places that have felt the same, in Jerusalem, in Delphi, in Rome, these kind of things. But that's a very strange place, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think yeah, I mean, and it's hard how we experience to, like, how do we experience a place is also interesting. So I honestly don't feel like I was there long enough to truly like experience it in its multifaceted nature, obviously. But I did have an experience which was, you know, someone walking next to me saying, "You walk like an Egyptian. Come by my," you know, these kind of more surface level things were taking up my feelings, I would say. But yeah, it's definitely a powerful place, I think, on the river, and it's, yeah, especially that gateway. That's why I chose it to share. So there's something about that.
Psychogeography, they call it. You know.
Okay.
Did you feel that in Sydney?
Do I feel connected to the geography? Or?
In you and your body, you know, just the same luminosity, because it's a numinous, you know, it's something which is not quite sort of a kind of, you can't explain, you can't verbalize what is there, right? Isn't it?
No, it's a very good question, because the way my body moves, I don't think is from this place. If you know what I mean. It moves in a different way, yeah, especially culturally, and yeah, let's say when I dance, or when I'm definitely, I mean, I'm born on this land, but yeah, it's an interesting relationship to the land that I have, I guess.
Are you saying that being at that threshold made you feel more Egyptian? Is that what you're saying? That you felt your body at a place where you belonged?
Not necessarily. I didn't necessarily feel Egyptian. Although, yeah, no, I didn't feel Egyptian. But it made me wonder about how, you know, an Egyptian would have felt looking up at that threshold, obviously. But yeah, and obviously sharing in us both obviously being humans.
Because we have thresholds like in Sydney Harbour. There's the threshold, if you stand on North or South Head or Middle Head, you see the threshold of the harbour, of where sea meets land. It's incredibly powerful. It's a natural threshold. I don't know.
I'd have to go there. You'd have to tell me the place. I'd be interested to see it. Yeah.
Are you in Sydney?
Yeah, I'm based in Sydney.
Yeah, just any one of the, if you go to North Head or South Head or Middle Head, and just, or even if you go to Middle Head and you look out through North and South Head, it's just such a gateway.
I'll go visit.
I saw an Aboriginal man once, and he said that Sydney Harbour is a woman's place, and that's why Captain Cook could invade. But in Botany Bay, it's a man's place. And if they'd settled there, they would have had a big fight on their hands. But because they came into a woman's place, the men they couldn't fight. I don't know, that's what he said. I just think that's so powerful. When I look out from Middle Head, I'm looking at it now. It's so powerful, that threshold. Anyway, sorry, I'm raving, but it's a similar kind of natural phenomenon here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree that also, I think obviously the landscape we're in also changes us, and obviously we have the power to adjust it constantly. And when we attune to this kind of the power it has, I think there's a lot of possibilities open up. Even the smallest things to how we arrange our desk in relation to the window. And yesterday during the talk, how I mean, I was outdoors. I was wearing a hat. I was worried if it wasn't as formal, but it was my shading device, you know. So, especially zooming.
You talk a lot about these things like shade and heat and cool, and the body that breathes and shrinks and expands with the heat and the cool. You speak a lot about these sorts of things. The indoor, outdoor, like even that building that breathes, it's an indoor and outdoor building, isn't it? Because it's breathing and moving and changing all the time. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it can be valuable, especially in terms of the seasons as well, in terms of, you know, the time of the day. I think it's important to ask these questions before we make as fixed actions as buildings can be, or forms can.
I would like to connect to you what you said with Fiona's paper before, because essentially she talked about the flows and the rhythms that we have. I mean, Heidegger has the term attunement about this. And I think what architecture does is to attune people with space, with the flows of space. Do you think, are you an architect yourself?
Yeah, I mean, officially no, but I have worked as an architect. Yeah, I'm not registered by the board at the moment, but yeah, of Australian architects. But
what's your ideal building?
Again, that totally depends on the place. I would say, the place and who, the aspirations of those that would inhabit it. But for me, materiality is really important. And there's so many layers to it. Political, you know, if I choose to, you know, in Barangaroo, they designed this wooden office buildings by Alex Sanz, I think. And, you know, on the surface, it seems really, you know, to address the climate, it's sustainable, it's wood, but then you ask, where did that wood come from? You know, and it was shipped from Eastern Europe. And then you know, there's all these repercussions. So I feel like with every gesture, with every action, you know, it's the materials, they all, even who will build the building plays a role, you know. So there's so many layers to every action. So I think, but my ideal building would consider all these things, which I definitely cannot do, but I try to sometimes. But yeah, material that speaks to me in an authentic way, I definitely appreciate. And wood seems to do so more than some of the other materials that have been emerging, have emerged. Like the feeling of wood under my feet or under anyone's feet is different to that of some laminated plastic, let's say. Not necessarily bad or good, but it's just different, you know. And there's repercussions. Obviously, we know that, but yeah.
Okay, I think we should probably have a 5-minute break before we start with the final talk. So why don't we just have a little 5 minutes out, and then Varas.
What's the name of the Finnish architect, Paolo? Can you write it down? So.
Yeah, Jani Palasma.
Can you type it there?
I'll type it for you. Yeah, I'll type it. Thanks everyone for the questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Don't forget the architect.
Yeah, I'm just checking in. Annalise, Tom delivered the steel. That was him making all the money.
Oh, that's good. All right, well, that's good. All right. Well, I better send him another bit of money, but yeah. But anyway, yeah, good. We're having a 5-minute break and then we're on the last session. Yeah. Sorry? What's that? Oh, very good. One of the better achievements of my life, anyway. But not so much. Oh, you're probably my greatest achievement. But it's really not so much what I had in mind, but what I made of creating an opportunity to show myself.
That was a fantastic talk, Jewell.
Thank you.
I liked what you said about the way, you know, that non-religions can be religious, like especially in the rhetoric of politicians, and the way that imagery, it's just fascinating. And also the Australian tendency to be anti-religious, but then it is religion. It's a religion. It's very complex. It was really good.
It is. It's very complex. Thank you.
It's good to see it articulated so well.
Thank you.
It doesn't happen very often in Australia. that kind of thinking reaches the mainstream.
Too much fear of the topic at all.
Yeah. And having to conform in order to be part of some tribal group so you can have money and a home and etc. Mm.
Okay, all right. Is everybody okay if we recommence? Yeah? Okay. Everyone's there at the moment. Look. Okay, Varas, I think if you want to start, you could, yeah.
Oh, all right, yeah. You know, I won't keep you long because I know that we're all tired so far, and it started raining as well in Sydney here. Thank you so much for having me the last to talk in this, bring it together, I think, or something like that. What I wanted, in the beginning, I wanted to talk about Heidegger and the phenomenological interpretation of Heidegger and the way that he actually perceived this environmental crisis that we are at the moment. But then I discovered this incredible last, if I may put it here, sort of a kind of Popwell encyclical, which is called Laudato Si, which was released in 2016, and it has essentially, what it tries to do is essentially address this environmental crisis in a way that I think that it is, we haven't seen before in, from an ecclesiastical authority. And because of, it was a document, although under the name of Pope Francis, that incorporated many philosophers, even, believe it or not, if the great sort of a kind of Marxist philosopher Habermas, it actually indicates that there is something sort of a kind of extremely interesting in the articulation of this encyclical. As you know, I mean, papal encyclicals from the past have been very negative, conservative, reactionary documents, but some of them have escaped this rule. If you remember the Rerum Novarum in 1896 by Pope Leo IX, you know, it was one of the most revolutionary sort of a kind of documents that we have at that period about the necessity of social change. This, in the beginning, if you remember, even John Paul II did something similar. But since religion and even mysticism and even a religious sensibility and that search for the miraculous and the numinous came so much in these discussions here, I thought it would be very good to explore this encyclical, because it unifies a lot of different themes and lines of thought. First of all, phenomenological lines of thought, environmental lines of thought, and then finally, which is very important in this case, an attempt to create a new vision about a sort of a kind of the environment from a new, totally new perspective. For some of you who are religious, usually the idea is that religion meant, you know, if you remember from the Genesis, that God gave, tell Adam that you are the ruler or overlord of this world. Now the translation, as you understand, is very wrong because it's a Protestant translation. Usually in the other translations, the idea is the custodian, as we translate it these days. And Laudato Si is a sort of a kind of, has the subtitle on the care of our common home. And the main theme of the encyclical is a criticism of consumerism, limitless development and growth, environmental degradation, global warming, and then finally what they call essentially swift and unified action. This is a very interesting thing because for the first time it incorporates the human phenomenon within the natural sort of the world, and thinks that this is a common home that we share with animals, since animals were discussed so many times in our meeting. And it's based, of course, in a very interesting, the title itself is interesting because it's based on the famous poem, The Canticle of the Sun by St. Francis of Assisi, which is an amazing poem for some of you who have read it, because it talks about the world, about the animals, and about the natural elements as brother and sister, by brother the fire, the sister the water, as he said. It's an affirmation of Francis' personal theology, as because the animals become his brothers, sisters to mankind, they rejected material accumulation. And if you remember, for some of you who are close to Francis's vision of humanity, he actually he rejected everything for what he called in favor of lady poverty. So the poem is very interesting itself. It was written in the 14th, 13th century in Umbrian of Italian dialect. And be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother, son, who bring the day, and you give light through him, the sun. And then we have the moon, also genderized as female, and we have this essentially complementary perception of the sun and the moon as representing the main forces of the universe. For some of you who close to theology, you remember that this is really sort of a kind of somehow scandalous, because it abolishes the distinction between a transcendent and an immanent God. That is to say, it creates a form of natural theology, of panentheism, of entheism. Even in the end, it relocates the numinous, the inexplicable, the awe-inspiring mystery within the natural creation, and which is a very interesting, almost prophetic element from the prophets of the Old Testament. And of course, sometimes, if you remember, Twin Paul's idea of the cosmic Christ. The most important element in this encyclical, and I think it's important because of what we discuss here, is that it propounds from the beginning the interconnectedness of nature and culture. Those two, I mean, we can't understand. If you remember, for some of you who are amongst us who are Darwinians, you believe that there is a moment of discrepancy, or if I may say, divergence between the natural and the cultural. In this tradition here, which goes back to mysticism probably, the interconnectedness of nature and culture becomes the most dominant theme of the whole document. Nothing in this world is indifferent to us. We are united by the same concerns. Keep in mind the idea of a concern in a Heideggerian sense. And what is happening to our common home happens to us. And it happens because, as he says, we have pollution and climate change, waste, and what they call the throwaway culture. This is a very interesting term that we have to use, and we'll discuss later on, the idea of the throwaway culture, that we actually do things, we buy, we make things, we create things, the consumer society, the commodity capitalism that became dominant after the 50s, only because we want to throw them away afterwards. It's a sense of garbage capitalism, as they called it, capitalism based on garbage, on things that we have to throw away. And essentially, this has led to the loss of biodiversity. It's, I think somebody mentioned before the concept of biophilia, and in this text appears here as biodiversity, and which is also a decline in the quality of human life, which leads, according to the text, to the breakdown of society. The breakdown of society also leads to the global inequality. As I said, poverty is part of the whole thing. And essentially, the universal communion of people, that is to say, the idea of the image and likeness of God in all humanity, and becomes essentially at the roots of the ecological crisis that we have today. Now, the document is not negative towards technology, because we recognize two elements. There is creativity in technology, and there is a power, will to power through technology, which is a very interesting, I think, a distinction to see that technology can be quite creative, can be quite imaginative, as we see with the Zoom and the computers that we have, but at the same time, it's power and domination. And the technocratic paradigm that has dominated, that has created the globalizing process that we have, essentially reflects a crisis in the effects of a modern anthropocentrism. The document actually relocates the importance of life. He uses the concept of life from the anthropic principle that this world was made only for humans and predominantly for humans, to the natural world as an interconnected continuum, as they call it. That the whole world is connected. That at the moment you break the part of the chain, the whole chain becomes totally deregulated. So the text proposes what they call an integral economy, ecology, which brings together environmental economics and social ecologies. And then finally, we have to educate for the world for a new covenant between humanity and the environment. Very interesting and quite I think explicitly the Pope calls that the ecological conversion. I think this is something that he took from Habermas in particular, and which can happen through the civic and political love, which goes back to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, which indicates that societies are kept together because of love, not because of interest. That we are to others close to societies because of, Aristotle calls it philia, that is to say friendship, love, and these kind of things. But essentially, this is why we are here, because we actually have the will and the tendency to love each other. It's a concept of intentionality that we had before as well. The interesting thing about this text is that it's based on Francis of Assisi and a very strange for some philosopher and Jesuit priest, Père Teilhard de Chardin, the first one who tried to essentially connect Darwinism and religion. And it's a very interesting text, his Human Phenomenon, which was banned during his lifetime, and it was released only after his death in 1955. Plus, as you see, it's very interesting, it's a universalist element that it appeals to a Sufi philosopher called Ali al-Khwakhwas, and at the same time Romano Guardini. The Sufi philosopher is very interesting here because essentially it indicates that prejudice should not, stresses that his own experience need not to be that distance between the creatures of the world and the interior experience of God. Prejudice should not have us criticize those who seek ecstasy in music or poetry. There is a subtle mystery in each of the movements and sounds of the world. The initiate will capture what is being said when the wind blows, the tree sways, the water flows, flies buzz, doors creak, birds sing, or the sound of the strings of flutes, the sighs of the sick, the groans of the afflicted. This is one of the most beautiful Sufi passages, which is used in a very important Christian document, or in the universalist documents. And of course, St. Francis of Assisi, because governs, just phrases, it's very close to this same feeling about the unity of everything, the interpenetration of everything. I'm not going to read these elements here, but essentially the most important aspect of the whole thing, I think, is that the document criticizes a consumerist vision of human beings, encouraged, as it says, by the mechanisms of today's globalized economy, which has a leveling effect on cultures, diminishing the immense variety, which is the heritage of all humanity. I think this is a very interesting phenomenological statement in this document, which has been discussed already and even studied by documents which have nothing to do with religious organizations, even sort of a kind of, in Cuba, this is one of the most famous documents that we discussed today, how we can restore the connection between humanity and nature. So essentially, I think this is a very sort of important document, and it ends with this, and I will end my presentation shortly there in 5 minutes, don't worry, because essentially it brings together three traditions that we see in the religious tradition of the West and the East, and probably it has very many references, implicit references to Buddhism, Hinduism, and even, as he calls it, the popular piety of the people of Latin America, referring obviously to Maya, the existing Maya and Aztec traditions that survive in that region through liberation theology. So there are three conceptual frameworks in this document, which is important, as I mentioned before, because it synthesizes all the lines of argumentation that we heard so far, in a sense that he tries to elucidate this interconnectedness between the world, the natural world, and humanity. With the main tradition, rationalist tradition after the Enlightenment in the West, we thought of the world as being, of the human phenomenon, as being essentially the overlord, the dominator of nature. The same happened later on with the Darwinian perception, which essentially created, a society against the natural world. Although if we study Darwin closer, we'll understand that this is not the case. And even later on, the German philosophy, German idealistic philosophy, which goes back to Rousseau, that essentially culture is against nature. Rousseau says that human beings are born free and they all live in our societies in chains. And then if you want to become free, he said, you have to go up to the Swiss mountains and dissociate yourself from everything that happens around you. This is the Rousseauian idea of the free individual, of the authentic individual, which later on, we remember, influenced the early Heidegger, probably the late Heidegger as well, after the turn, and then also existentialism. The idea of freedom that we have in Sartre, that it is an absolute dissociation of human beings from the environment for which they take responsibility for their choices, and then finally they can reinvent themselves. I don't know, we discussed already about this. Can we reinvent ourselves? Can we redefine who we are without reference to the conditions that have formed us? Can we take out of us our childhood? Can we dissociate ourselves from our parents? Because so far we talked about mortality, but I would make an appeal to the idea of Hannah Arendt as the most important thing is not our mortality, that we're going to die, but our natality, the fact that we've been born. And natality is essentially the principle of fecundity, of artistic, imaginative, and existential fecundity that we have as individuals. Because mortality, we know that we're going to die, but we tend to forget that we've been born. And we tend to forget that the artistic creativity is about what Plato used to call a birth through beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yay!
You agree with that, Anna?
Yes.
That's one of the most famous Platonic statements from the Symposium. That's tokos, through or in beauty. That is to say, a very important sort of a kind of statement that we have, that essentially, and this is what this text tries to restore. So there are three elements that we see in this tradition. First of all, the Dominican ideal of contemplative action, that we have to take a step back and contemplate on the consequences of what we have done. Second, the Franciscan wonderment in front of the living world, in front of nature. And then finally, which is, I believe, it's the most important thing in here. All of them are equally important, of course, but this one brings them all together. The Jesuit ideal of what they call consciousness examen, the examination of your consciousness constantly. And so this attempt is, we have to harmonize the colliding and paradoxical pluralisms that we see today. A few years ago, I had the students, just at the University of Sydney, they couldn't understand the difference between cultural pluralism and cultural relativism, which was a very interesting, sort of a semantic confusion that most people have. The cultural relativism, anything goes, and cultural pluralism, which means that all traditions have importance to exist, are equally important in this case. So essentially, what I want to conclude with and say that this is my point about this presentation is, in this document, which you can find easily on the net, you can go to the Vatican website and download it quite freely. And I strongly recommend to read it in Latin, which is very, it's amazing language, Latin, I strongly recommend. Is that essentially it's for the first time that we see religion now actually changing, becoming disendorsing itself, especially the powerful institutional religion of Catholicism, this endorsing and dissociating itself from the commodity capitalism that we have seen it from the 16th and 17th century. Remember the famous book by Weber, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Essentially, this went together for a certain period, and then they were dissociated, as Marx said in the Communist Manifesto. All that is, solid melts into thin air. So this text gives us a very important, I think, beginning for a new linguistic formulation of a new natural philosophy and anthropology, which was lost through this excessive romanticization that the modern philosophy went through after the influence of Heidegger in particular. We must not forget that Heidegger, deep down, is a sort of a kind of German nihilist. Nothing really matters. That's why he never renounced Nazism. And he actually remained, if you saw his black notebooks recently, I mean, he continued his anti-Semitism till the last day of his life. And his admiration for Hitler. So I think that now, I mean, the ecological crisis has reached a critical moment, and we need a major alliance of forces to bring it under control and restart, as it were, the cultural conditioning of humanity in order to deal with this very strong and rather very profound and sometimes radical re-articulation of our position in history. This is a unique text which goes beyond, I believe, the religious implications within one church, because essentially, and sometimes I have heard it in our discussions here, it avoids the eschatological imagery that we see, the apocalyptic world, the post-apocalyptic world. We talked about the movies. All the movies recently are about a post-apocalyptic world because it's an environmental crisis. For some of you who have seen The Road by or read the book by Cormac McCarthy, or this kind of, it indicates that there's an end, an eschatological end to humanity. This believes in something else. I believe, and this is how I will finish. This is a sort of a kind of a belief that our common house, domus communis in Latin, becomes the most important universal communion space, as they call it. And I like this expression, for the synergy of humanity in order to redefine its position in history. Now, I mean, of course, that comes throughout many philosophical ideas, but we can then extrapolate this theological perspective and actually create a new anthropology, as I said, about our human home, with a new anthropology of human presence within the natural world, considered as a manifestation of the natural world, articulating, therefore, a unique response to the prevailing paradigms of absence that has dominated modern absence and loss that has dominated all recent debates. I think that the text is interesting because it's an optimistic text, that human beings, through their own sense of wonderment, that they can admire and feel awe in front of nature, can redefine their activity within nature, and essentially see that nature offers a synergy, a hand of alliance with them, and recreate their position, our common house, as he said, the domus communis. That's why he sees, and if I may, I will finish with this, a sort of the necessity of a new ontotheology, theology of presence, of demonstrative truthfulness, as he calls it, in an attempt to create a new paradigm of relating to nature and therefore relation with the other human beings. It's a very important text. It essentially stops seeing humanity as sinful, as morally sinful, and sees humanity as sinful towards nature. That we actually, the moment that we destroy nature, then the catastrophic impact that we have on nature is the sinfulness of humanity, the proclivity to be fallible, to make mistakes. And essentially, finally, and I will finish with this, it indicates, sorry, let me go to the final paragraph, because the whole thing is essentially, despite the, based on, the I don't want to be very philosophical here, the neo-Gnostic perception that we have, the dualism that we have between conflict between political religions of modernity and the old humanistic religions that go back to the Renaissance, that we have the opportunity to re-articulate what this text calls the mysterious presence of humanity within the natural universe and the natural world. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I kept for so long. And of course, the idea, the Christian prayer at the end of union is about union with creation. The poor and the earth are crying, "O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us protect our life to prepare the better future for the coming of our kingdom of justice, peace, and love and beauty," which is essentially, I think, it's a completely new language of theology from the previous one, which was about a language of domination and self-alienation, if I may say. Thank you. I hope it's not very theological, eh? Yeah, Jewell told me here that if we can convince the Catholic Church to dissociate itself from the the Vatican Bank, you can't convince them dissociating themselves from the mafia.
Ah, yes.
And the Vatican Bank is the easiest thing to do. The mafia is the problem.
Yes.
Singing Godfather #3. Yeah, of course. I think this is a document which was produced by people who are very close to the Catholic Church, but they're not strictly within the traditional framework of mind that we see. That's why it's so important in America, in the States. I mean, you can, sort of, if I may use a term, unpack the syllogism that we have here, and you see there's a modernist way of thinking, a postmodernist way of thinking, and traditionalist way of thinking in this synergistic model of coexistence of tendencies that we see. And it's a kind of collaborative, may I use a strange Greek term, a palimpsestic way of writing, the one over the other, and they are coexist in a very interesting sort of, and I think very, very for the future fruitful way, because otherwise, as you see, I believe that we can, in all projects of talking about environmental crisis, there is always a religious element. And religion is, if I may use what Neil and Stuart said, performance, the dramaturgical performance, right? You can, I mean, it's a close, it's a ritual, is all of the above. You don't have religion without rituals. Rituals are very important because they're bonding, sort of a form of bonding, of societal bonding, they're forms of subliminal connection with the other. They're also, they actually, the only rituals that they not otherize people. They bring them in, the moment you, anyway, thank you.
Well, the ritual makes it active also. So it's not just an ideological construct.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was very interesting. You also mentioned how the uniformity, which was so obvious in what Paolo showed with the Koolhaas photo, and then now the buildings just a few years ago. Oh my gosh, where's the different identity, like language?
Well, if you come to Sydney University, you'll see the new museum building that they have in front of the old building. This is Soviet brutalism at its worst, as you understand. It's like you have the impression that you're in 1966 in Leningrad, in front of this incredible, classical building of the, the Oxbridge, just where this was like an atrocity, as you understand. But they think that's very, very cool to have, and it's a building which probably will be demolished in a few years. But this is we have it there because managerialism. Of managerialism, that's the problem. You know, just unfortunately, capitalism has sort of becomes bureaucratic capitalism, so bureaucratized that the innovative elements, you remember the idea of Schumpeter of creative destruction, does not exist anymore. It has become a conformism, a form of conformism, and sort of obeying, sort of a kind of something that has been standardized. You cannot de-standardize now, even what Paolo said before, you know, the way that we understand urban spaces. And that's why they built this horrible. Yes, sorry, Anna.
Oh, sorry, by the way, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I didn't realize I was unmuted. Sorry. I guess at that moment you were talking about Hannah Arendt, and you were talking about, I mean, what's interesting about the document you're describing is that Francis of Assisi is personifying aspects of nature in terms of family. And you brought up this notion of, you know, can we redefine ourselves? You know, can we escape our language? Can we escape our childhood, our parents? And then you talked about Hannah Arendt and natality. And then you talked about the birth of beauty. I thought that was a really interesting run of thoughts. I guess associative. You're going from one to another. I liked it a lot because
totally rational. Yeah.
No, it's good. What I'm trying to do in my biblical Hebrew poetry in relation to Psalms is I'm trying to give a voice to the child, because in Psalms, for example, there's no voice of a child. It's always the oppressive parents. But I'm trying to do it through beauty. I'm trying to re-articulate its language in the biblical Hebrew, but I'm trying to do it beautifully and through music. So I sing the songs. But I'm also personally trying to escape my own childhood through doing that. Like, I have a Jewish mother and a German father. So I'm trying to reinvent through a different relationship to the past. I'm trying to reinvent through the cultural forms I'm given, through having a Jewish mother and a German father, but then try and redefine those things.
How did this work out? Because that's very, very important now, what you're just saying. You know, it's incredible.
That's what I'm trying to do. And it sounds like that's what we must do. I've been trying to do this my whole life. I have a German father, all German. I have a Jewish mother, all Jewish. So I have to think about the Holocaust. I have to think about things like anti-Semitism. I have to think about, why is my mother crazy? Why is my father violent? I have to think about those things. I have to respond to them. I have to create beauty in response to the Holocaust. I have to. Or I'm dead.
You are the beauty of that thing.
Well, that's what I hope. I hope I'm not the violence and the ugliness.
It's the existential witness that you bring to the whole thing, isn't it? You know, that you bring them all together. I mean, it's, you create a fusion of oppositions, you know.
That's it. And that's why I can never speak in one language. That's what I mean about, like, I'm reinventing a language, and it's not biblical Hebrew, and it's not German, and it's not Australian, and it's not, so I don't know what this has got to do with the environment. I'm sorry, but this notion of beauty, I mean, the Psalms doesn't mention the environment very much, I have to say. It mentions the body a lot. And I know that, Stuart, you were critical of this notion of the body, but the Psalms' relationship to the body is so visceral, so alive, so, you know, fire and water are these.
But they say the stars narrate the glory of God, and the, you know, famous, incredible expressions from the Psalms, you know, just, you know, stars really, witness the glory of God and the works of his hands, you know, just
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It's an amazing cosmic and cosmological vision that you see in the Psalms.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's
one
true.
of the most beautiful texts ever written, I think.
Yeah, me too.
Hi, it's Jan here. I'm just worrying. Your exposition of that document was very beautiful, and it certainly brought to the forefront the value of empathy and the recognition of our inherent relationship to the natural world, and the value of consumerist restraint. But for me, as a former Catholic, I don't think you ever get to be a former Catholic, but I find it interesting that this becomes a document about climate change, or how we can change our attitudes so that we can change what's happening to us. But it's a thing of do as I say, not as I do. If you think about, and I want your sort of view on this, on the Catholic Church's policy on birth control.
Bad, yeah, horrible. I mean, the problem, as I said, the Catholic Church, if I may say, because of global appeal, global presence, is many Catholic churches, essentially. Right? I don't think. I mean, the Pope represents the tradition of uniting all these kind of things, the papal office. But I think these documents expressed precisely the sort of the kind of the plurality of traditions that we have within the Catholic Church, and because the Catholic Church represents a sort of kind of just a motley mob of different people, just the Catholics of Poland, the liberation theology of Nicaragua and South America, the black theology of South Africa, and the communities in the United States, but at the same time represents very, very sort of the conservative Bavarian Germans, right? Benedict, for example, who used to be my teacher as well. I mean, all of these things. I think we have to see the document historically. We have to situate it. This is what happens when too many people from different walks of life and different cultural positions and positions of power. Don't forget that liberation theology was the first thing that John Paul renounced when he became the Pope. And he accepted that Paul Romero was killed by the fascists in Nicaragua in his own church, and he didn't say a word. So, I mean, I understand what you mean, because they have also not simply abortion, they have about family, if I may say, planning in general. Remember the position about AIDS, people with, just the bioethical tradition is really, really silly in puerile almost that they have. But I think that some documents essentially escape that very strict censorship and create their own tradition of their own, especially during the case of the environmental crisis that we have at the moment. We have to solve this problem. And otherwise, I think the whole world as we know it will change, will be transformed to something totally different. We have to have the population has to be controlled. We must have almost Malthusian tactics of controlling population, which essentially will be, really problematic, if I may use, not to say another term. It's a problematization of the problem. How can you use Malthus in order to solve the problem of humanity? Some of us have to be executed, and I think probably us as people of culture will be the first ones, will be out of here, this kind of thing. But anyway, I know what you mean, and I can't justify the tradition. I'm not a Catholic myself, as I told you, although I studied a lot I'm not even religious, to be honest, because I believe that religion is as Ezra Pound said, is the trap of literature against humanity and human mind, but essentially we have to see the imagery and the language of the work that they articulated, which unfortunately has captured some of the greatest spirits of history worldwide. That's why I mentioned the Sufis as well, the Sufi tradition, which is an Islamic tradition, so beautiful and so sort of a kind of close to us as well. And the Hindu imagination, the Chinese imagination, the whole imagination, unfortunately, is suffused with religious imagery. Or fortunately, for some people. You're the artists, you will tell us what you think about that. I mean, Jewell, before you were talking about there's a religious sensibility in contemporary art.
Oh, yes, because it can't help but continue. It's the mystery, it's too primary. So this is how it continues to manifest within, as you said, the civil religion. The mythological, the religious, subjective, traditional, new, it cannot be denied. Right down to if Nike is your god, so to speak. It might have been the old style, but now it's the companies, your Nike, Adidas, all of that. It is going to manifest in some fashion because it's the story that there's that hole that needs to be told, needs to be related to. It will be found.
And it has to do with symbolic thinking as well. The fact that we think with symbols. Yeah, sorry.
Can't hear you, Stuart. I think symbolic thinking is at the basis of religion and art.
And culture.
Yes, I think symbolic thinking is how we think. And that's the problem with our current discourse in the mainstream media anyway, not this discourse, but there's no symbolic thinking. There's no space for it.
I think that's a great point, Anna. I was thinking about it earlier when Fiona and Paolo were speaking too. I mean, the power behind, well, you're a team of high-level phenomenologists. There's sort of discourse about, it's missing, about advertising and the subliminal messages and the vast resources and highly developed and structured and implemented mechanisms to control us sub-awareness or below the phenomenological level. So how do you guys fit in to this symbology?
Well, that's the problem, is that our own nature, our symbolic nature, is being prostituted to consumerism and power. So when I saw Josh Frydenberg talking this week, and he was saying they can't spend any more money, and the economists are saying, no, the government has lots of money, they can print money. Then I knew that it's just a joke. They could put millions and billions of dollars into art and symbolic thinking, but they don't, because they want to maintain the status quo. And what it means is that we suffer. So the expression of the sacred suffers, the expression of nature suffers, our own nature suffers. That's what I think anyway.
Am I audible now?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Sorry, I missed that last point, Anna. Sounded pretty big. What I was trying to say before was when Jewell was speaking, and I was thinking about the power of the representation of the power of the relationship between representation and religious experience. And I think that as Jewell was saying just before I went offline, Jewell appears to have gone, does she? Yeah.
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. You're there. You've moved on my screen. I don't think that there is any more important question for me as a philosopher in the age of the absconding of the gods than the question of God. And so, like Heidegger said in 1966, the only thing that can save us now is a God, in the Der Spiegel interview. I think that what was good about Bras's paper and about your paper, Jewell, was it's kind of saying, what does it mean now for somebody like me who is in this weird, tiny little cultural corner in the whole history of humanity where we think we've thought our way out of our gods? How does the question of God work? Because I'm pretty sure that it's the fact that we have been abandoned by the gods that is somehow the root of this problem.
Really, really good point. And it's why so many from all sides, all aspects, in all ways, the representation, the symbolism, however, are working to grapple with that.
Yeah, when I did my PhD years ago, it was about audiences, and the answer to my question of my PhD, which was what does it mean to be in an audience, ended up as the divine is the essence of the human. And it was such a profound thing for me at that stage that how do I re-find the divine in the age of the absconding of the gods? The earth seems to me to figure quite profoundly in that somehow.
It's if I may say, Stuart, we cannot define the divine. It's an event. It's an encounter.
Mm.
I see more as an encounter, the whole thing. You know, you rationalize about that, but define it afterwards, after it happened. You know, just it's an event that brings you into liminal situations of being in ecstatic an existence. You know, just transcendence of yourself in this case. I think so. You know, just I haven't experienced that, although
But that rapture that you're describing, that transcendence of self, to me, somehow haunts everything that this whole 2 days has been working towards. That hunger for that transcendence and that dissolution of I am this fixed individual, this thing that is going to die when this body reaches a certain point where its organs fail. How do I become part of the everything in a meaningful way, knowing that fact? And that attempt to rejoin or to be a part of or something seems to me to be haunting everything we're talking about.
You people from the performance studies, you must have that feeling, don't you?
Yeah.
You recreate that. I think what Peter Hall called the empty space becomes a place of emergence, isn't it? You create something which didn't exist with your presence as well. I think so. You know.
And I think it's an experience of time, a re-experience of time, a kind of a more. Somebody was talking about chronos before. It's a more now experience of time. Yeah, of it being the right time. A time that's not an impossible present, escaping from an irretrievable past into an inconceivable future.
I think, Stuart, you said the right word, being. And I think in all the presentations I've heard that repeated. So surely the divine isn't something that you only get to once you've shed the mortal coil, but being is the everyday moment. Being is the attitude that is not that we're not purely just a mechanical reductionist machine, that lives in the world. We live through our religions, we live through our passions, we live through understanding and our cognizing and trying to understand the world. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you were going to try and find a solution for the environmental crisis, how would we do that other than to try and improve our sense of being in the world?
And the being
Exactly.
of the world, and being for the world, if I may use Sartrean terminology, being in the world and being for the world as well, I think.
Of, from, and for, I think, yes. The for, the ethics of that being for, I think is hugely important.
And then other side of it being in the body, there's a wonderful guy called Philip Shepherd, who's a Canadian actor, and he's got a wonderful teaching on being more present in the body. So that's a very practical way of becoming more, well, becoming out of becoming and more into being through the body. So I think someone else mentioned it before, I'm not sure if it's Paolo or Jewell, becoming more sensitized to the world. So becoming more sensitized to the world, then we get out of this, maybe I should use the word delusional, but religious aspect where we live in this kind of incosant shell, whether it's intellectual or visceral, that separates ourselves from our environment, and so we can't actually tell when we're living in a wooden hut or in a cave or whatever, and we can't interact with our beings that are around us, and therefore until we have a more sense of being in our bodies, and then being socially, and then being in the Mother Earth, under Brother Sun or Mother Earth, then that's the first step possibly to more of an environmental awareness.
I think that Neil's point and Fiona's point this morning has really excited me on that, in that as somebody who is trained as a phenomenologist since the late 1990s, what Neil told me yesterday and what Fiona was pointing to this morning was that in the skill that I have learned as a phenomenologist of how to inhabit situations and things that I'm doing in a way where I create a kind of another level, that reflexive phenomenological attitude within it, that perhaps that practice can be a way to be able to dwell in a more reflexive and therefore more in a way that's not so destructive, in a way that can approach the divine.
I think that sounds entirely reasonable, and I would say that your intellect is directing your divinity towards a different attitude of being in the world. Just as Stuart's, your performance in the landscape and Paolo's use of clay and other people's dissertations or walking amongst the students or talking with the students, or Anna's artwork.
Stuart, Jan, I'd just like to make a comment, maybe that might open up that idea of divinity a bit more, that the experience of the divine is, and the experience of being in the world, of the world, is often associated with a collapse of time, or an experience of deep time which is beyond our usual linear sense of time. I mean, we experience all different sorts of times throughout our lives, but that experience of the divine tends to be like that, and that it's also and Kant talks about this when he talks about the sublime experience, that it is actually one of terror, because in that moment the separation of ourself from the world ceases to exist, and we're only pulled out of that experience when we reflect on it. but the actual experience itself is a collapse of all time, and of separation, and that is like the experience of the divine, or the divine might be part of that experience.
And I think what Harrington and Stuart and you, Jan, what Jeremy had said yesterday about we're 70% water, the planet's 70% water, or, you know, the bones composed in the earth. It's like we are an extension, not just a reflection, not something to relate to. We are the same stuff that where we live is made of. So, and the time thing that Jan, you're bringing up, when Jeremy got me to the reef 30 years ago, I can say that even though I've been in so many amazing, extraordinary natural environments, that only at the reef, underwater, did I find, not looking for it, but I just found, oh my gosh, I have a sense of millions of years, even though there's no way to have that sense. But I have never had such a collapse and expansion of time as in this country, which kind of went with the timeless land thing. I couldn't tell the time of day, because in America, at least then, it was as if it was a weight on your shoulders. I could have told you within 10 minutes what time it was at any point. But here, even if I did the math, I knew I got up at 8, I knew I did this, I knew I did that. I was never closer than 2 hours off. There's not the same sense of time here. So I think getting into how we have experiences, how what we think we know collapses, how and when we're thinking about what it all kinds of re-scrambles. It's huge.
Yeah, that's why I spoke about that collapse of time, but also that sense of deep time in the experience of the divine or of the sublime. And I think that also is what causes a sort of expansion and contraction at the same time. The moment of reflection brings us back into that idea of time as past, present, and future, and then draws us out of the experience again.
But it seems that it's the exception that we lose this sense of structured industrial time in which we're in all the time, and we occasionally go into some sort of kairotic time state, almost by accident or in performance. It can happen not quite a lot, but it happens occasionally in performance. I think part of the thing that needs to be done here is to find the skill set of being able to develop a kairotic time sense and have more conscious control of being in that kairotic time.
Yes, Jan and Stuart, I had an experience at a modern no play in Sydney in Adelaide, and it was incredibly slow movement, totally silent. The only sound was water dripping on stage. It was called the Water Station. And exactly what you're talking about, time, it was 2 hours of no dialogue, slow motion movement. People just appeared on stage and exited, but at a glacial pace. 5 minutes, they moved 2 meters. So the intensity of the Japanese and their knowledge of silence and time and listening is really, really fascinating to me. And I'm doing a master's on this very theme of silence. And this is exactly what you're talking about, Jan and Stuart, this whole thing of time and how I felt after 2 hours of silence, just dripping water on stage, no words, and just an enormous sense of beingness the whole time, and afterwards almost mute. And since 84, I have picked up the thread, which I'm now kind of working on, but it's probably the most extraordinary theatre experience I've ever had, even though I've seen a lot of theatre. So yeah, it's just a little bit about, yeah.
It's a beautiful example, Renata, about how art can change our sense of being.
Yes, and yeah, it's never left me. And yeah, absolutely. I think there's a possibility in the silence and no language. There's a possibility of us slowing down too. I think that right brain, intuitive, I don't need to use that term really, but I think that opening of consciousness occurred in the 5 people I was with as well. And none of us have forgotten that particular experience.
Could I just say something? This is the first time I speak. And Renata, I know the director of that piece, and I only saw it, I didn't see it live, I saw it on video. So it's really lovely to hear your experience. But in one way, I've been sitting listening to everybody for 2 days. And I feel very new to this whole environment of academia. But yeah, it's been a great, great pleasure. Really, really lovely. So I just want to thank you all.
Thanks, Tess.
There's just commenting on Renata's experience. I'm wondering then, including some of the expositions of different thinkers' ideas about this, but also how then do we harness those things? How do we populate theatre or art in general with these ideas? And maybe that's part of the way forward in terms of the relationship to climate change, because basically what Renata's saying is that experience of sort of wholeness and relationship to what was surrounding her created the connections that we've been talking about in terms of our connection to the natural world. And then how do we take those and harness them? And maybe there's a whole lot that's been said in the last couple of days that could actually be put together and not as a manifesto, because we don't want another one of those, but as a way of going forward in terms of, you know, how we as artists evoke or provoke these ideas. You know, that's our thing of, as you said, for the world, Stuart. You know, do we need to now identify what those tendencies are? I think that's what's happened, but then how do we play them out? You know, how do we make them more populous within society? You know, how do we make them valuable to society rather than, you know, money or wealth or accumulating possessions? Because that's what has caused what we have in terms of the climate crisis.
Big question. But I think that it goes to what Vras was saying yesterday, that it's how it requires such a major shift in fundamental attitude, in fundamental mood, the basic question that we as a culture, as a civilization in the West, ask about everything is, what is that? And I've said it before in the last couple of days, a couple of times. How does it work? What's it made of? But we need to cultivate an entirely different approach to the everything, which is, I think, to be found in silence and in awe. This is why I asked the question before about awe. All of the religious states seem to entail awe. And Heidegger actually says we need to find a fundamental mood of awe in front of everything. Not of wonder and what is it, but of a being stopped and moved by everything. And sure, in the performance technique that everybody in my group learned from Tess, there are plenty of exercises that actually do that in a really concrete way. If you've got half a dozen people all moving at 1 millimetre per second for 15 minutes, the whole nature of that group's perception and their whole sense of time changes. But say, everybody is tied up in purpose. Everybody is tied up in an intentionality of a telos and outcome. You need to get people out of that into just sort of this whole other attitude. And how do you do that?
And get out of spectacle, because everything
Yes.
is overwhelming spectacle, and spectacle is not awe.
Kill the audience.
Okay, it's approaching 4:30, and I think silence and awe is probably a good point to wrap it up on. So I'd like to thank everybody for contributing and attending, and I think it's been really quite an opening experience for everybody who's participated, and hopefully we'll run into each other again at some other event. And thank you again for participating. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yay.
And
Thank you
thanks,
so
Neil,
much.
thanks so much for organising it.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question, Neil?
Yeah.
It seems to me, I just wrote some notes over the last couple of speakers, and it seems to me that a really coherent theme has emerged out of this little 2-day event. And that each of the speakers has been like one crystalline facet on a larger question. When you curated the event, were you aware that that's what you were doing?
No, not really. I just felt certain people would bring something interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think you made a little bit of magic for me anyway.
Well, thank you. All right, so I think we'll leave it there if that's okay with everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks,
All
Neil.
right.
Thanks,
More
everyone.
magic.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for your comments and enthusiasm, Anna.
Thank you. Oh, yes.
By all.
Thanks very much for everything. Wonderful.
Yeah.